Thank you so much for giving us this time and space to talk about building mutual trust and relationships. I originally wanted to do this panel because of a consistent finding across the cities that Freya mentioned, but also, 3 or 4 other ones that I've been working in. And when I talk to people who live in the communities that are most affected by first response, and I ask them to imagine this transformed first response system, they always say there's a role for police. They always say that law enforcement has to be a part of that, right? These are the community members who are living in these spaces. And so what that means is that we have to address the elephant in the room. Even in this newly reimagined system, there will be law enforcement. And so we have to think about trust. And for us on the panel, we recognize that that elephant in the room has 2 ends, right? On one end, it's communities who have either lost or never built trust with law enforcement in terms of whether or not they're going to respond, how quickly they'll respond, and if that response leads to worse outcomes. And we have to remember also the tail, which is law enforcement or sworn officers in that system who really don't have a lot of trust in civilians. And part of that civilian group are alternative responders. So how do we build mutual trust going back and forth? And I do recognize that this isn't an issue specific to law enforcement first responders, right? In our conversations, there's an issue of trust between social workers and community members, EMS, right? But we have a limited amount of time here. And so we don't want to stay on the surface. We want to dive in. So we're going to really focus mainly on one. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists because you all have their bios and can read them. And we're going to model using first names only, which we do in most of our convenings, meetings, events, just to not introduce potential hierarchies with titles, and to avoid using pronouns so that we can engage in conversations where we're recognizing that we're talking about. So I'm Tamara. And I'd like to introduce also Nick and Ariel at the end. They have been really doing some, I don't even know how to describe it, such intense, engaged work to really bring together sworn officers and civilians to establish shared responsibility for public safety, right? So building or rebuilding the social contract where everyone has a role in decision-making, those kinds of things. Nick brings to this scholarship, he's very scholarly, but also just this wealth of wisdom from lived experience, from being involved in law enforcement all the way from the dispatcher level to ending his, well, not ending your career, sorry, to being a police chief. And Ariel brings to that work a lot of experience facilitating and sometimes even moderating discussions and work groups between communities that have had historical, deep-rooted mistrust. And she also introduces to the conversation this issue of the international context and that this isn't a uniquely American problem. We can look beyond our borders too for solutions. Jordan is an extremely thoughtful young person. You'll see in his bio that he is a leader of Young, Not Silent. And he really encapsulates that in every way, not just for himself, but by giving space to other youth to raise their voices and think about building relationships that are respectful between anyone with enforcement power and youth. And finally, Maru, I call her Maru, and yes, everyone can call her Maru. She is an activist in every sense of the word for marginalized populations on the border. So her day-to-day, daily interaction is helping to navigate through systems where there's been broken trust and helping people to rebuild that. So as we proceed, I'm going to ask everyone to give an opening statement. And then I'll ask just 2 questions. And I tell you that because you don't have to worry about formulating your questions or articulating while they're speaking. You can do that when I'm speaking during my questions. And we would like to leave a lot of time for you all to engage with them. So I'm going to stop babbling on and ask Nick to start us off with an opening statement.
Thank you, Tamara, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone. I particularly want to say thank you for the days that we've shared together. They've been very informative. They've just been a great opportunity for us to share new ideas and open ourselves to new thoughts. I have to give a quick plug for the Institute for American Policing Reform, because I'm keenly aware that most of you are unaware of who we are. We have been around for what will be 3 years, it will be 3 years in July, but we deliberately spent about 2.25 years in incubation or research and development period. We started with an immediate partnership with 2 of the world's largest law firms, with Weil, Gotshal, Manders, and Hogan Lovells, and the American Institute for Research as our partners, as we really wanted to approach our bringing about change in American policing through a very evidence-based approach to change. And as we are now coming out and going into communities, and when we say community, we don't mean the police and the community. We mean community, right? The police are a part and are within the community. And so we don't speak in separate language in that context, we just say community. And I want you to think of it as being inclusive of those who have that responsibility for policing. And so as we're coming out and developing councils around in states across the country to really discover what we will believe will be the most promising practices for policing reform, we are not going to places doing reform. We are going to places at this stage to discover the most promising practices for reform by taking that information from the communities so that we can present that eventually to the nation. So before we begin talking about trust, I'm reminded of a time when I was leading a discussion with the Prime Minister and his cabinet of the tiny island nation of Grenada. And we were talking about leadership, ethical leadership. And as I led the discussion, I immediately launched into touching on the tenets of ethical leadership in government. And the Prime Minister stopped me in his beautiful Caribbean and British accent and said, "Nicholas, please, would you offer to us an opportunity to concur on the meaning of leadership before we engage around this topic?" So I would like to offer you, so that we may concur and agree that we are on the same page, a definition of trust. Fair enough? So I would like to propose that for the purpose of our discussion, trust is the belief that those on whom we depend will meet our positive expectations of them, especially when we are at our most vulnerable. Fair enough? Would that work for our point of discussion? So with that, I'll go on. Now, put it in perspective of police. We tend to call the police in situations where we are somewhat vulnerable, right? We agree. We are in those circumstances where we feel we are facing some vulnerability, and we need intervention into that. Now, we do not necessarily trust the police when we call them, if we're really honest, right? Because there's a difference between trust and confidence, right? When we have confidence in someone, confidence arises out of specific knowledge or facts, right? We might assume this is their job. I know this is their job and they have to do their job. So I'm going to call them in to do their job. And so it doesn't necessarily amount to a reflection of trust as much as it reflects confidence that the representatives of the police agency are going to do their jobs. Now, we have to keep in mind that police officers are somewhat conditioned to operate in an environment of trust. Let me explain that. The internal trust tends to be pretty high. I mean, let's face it, how many police officers here? I mean, there's a few. I mean, internally, we tend to have higher trust of one another. It's like, you know, we've got each other's back. As a former chief of police, I can go into a police department, show my badge as a former chief of police, and there's almost an immediate acknowledgement of trust. Would you agree? It's just kind of a given. But the external aspects of trust are not necessarily so high, right? There are fear factors, and in the post 9/11 area, it particularly went up. Everybody's kind of out to get you. You know, there's that factor it's become unfortunate, but it has become a reality of how police are operating. So in a team or a common effort, trust is based upon the assumption that people are both able and willing to use their power and their abilities to advance a common good, right? So if we're working together, we're going to use that power, use that ability to advance that common good. And where that trust exists, it increases the likelihood that people at all levels are going to act in a very trustworthy manner. Now, yesterday's closing panel, I really enjoyed the closing panel yesterday. We were talking about the alternative methods in Denver and Albuquerque and other places were highlighted because they really very specifically demonstrated that despite the fact that perhaps their service weren't immediately wanted, by accomplishing what they accomplished, they were able to gain trust. And we'll eventually talk about how that's such a key part of the tenets of maintaining and establishing trust about getting things done. So I believe that for us to build new strength in public safety and in community wellness, it requires that policing entities, that municipalities, counties, and its residents are willing to dramatically change or even abandon many of its past practices. That's a hard pill to swallow in many cases. Building trust is at the center of change. Trust increases the likelihood that people will abandon past practices in favor of new approaches. Trust is, in fact, a resource. It's a form of sort of collaborative capital that can be used to great advantage. Mutual trust is critical to support radical change, right? The more radical the change, the more essential the need for great trust. And we have to keep in mind that low trust environments are extremely difficult to change. This trust is typically self-sustaining and resistant to improvement even in the face of positive information or events or information that the change could be better for us all. So I want to leave it at that as we transition, and we'll talk today and lay the foundation for us talking about trust in communities and among police.
Good morning. My name is María Eugenia Carrasco, and I'm coming from Tucson, Arizona. I'm a volunteer in Derechos Humanos Coalition, and I've been doing that for more than 20 years. I want to go a little bit on the story of Derechos and how I came into that organization. We are grassroots and we are very poor. We survive on donations, and that's because we are very political. If we want to make changes in our communities and make them safer, we need to change policies. It's one of the main things that we've been doing. Our main goal was at first, after 9/11, like Nick says, everything went down the hill. The migrants became the scapegoats of every problem in America. And the thing is that we started looking at more militarization of the border. And at that time, we started looking at more and more death on the desert. My phone is right here with me because I have 2 hotlines. People are calling, looking for loved ones who are being abandoned by the coyotes at the border and on the desert. And people are looking for people who are lost in detention. Right now with Title 42, it was dropped by Biden. We're seeing more and more people trying to cross the border because they're so desperate. They're coming, and with this Title 42, people were supposed to wait at the borders for 3 months or so to get refugee status. Now with Title 8, which is what Biden implemented, people are coming from South America and other countries from Europe and Africa. And every time they cross a border, they need to ask permission for each country they cross. They cannot just come into America like that. And so they're practically killing the program. So people are very desperate. People are jumping the border, coming in with kids, babies, pregnant ladies who are running away from the cartels, the violence, and different governments who are socialist. And people are really starving in these countries and having a lot of issues. The people who are dying in our desert are the ones that are poor, the ones that don't have money. Because I've seen a lot of like Venezuelan people who are educated, who have money, who are running away from a socialist government, coming in a plane, asking for refugees. And these people are educated. They have a lot of things to come, to America. And so the people who are really dying out there are poor people. So right now we have 162 remains that were found in the desert. And this is getting bigger and bigger, the number. So that's why we've been organizing, especially police. Every time they say police, I used to hate that name. Now I'm very humbled to be here. I want to thank each and every one of you because you are changing this world. You are changing our communities. At first I was very iffy. I didn't want to be here. I'm going to have to be fighting. I'm going to have to be, arguing about what's going on, especially when you live in a border town, less than 100 miles from the border. This is another world. Arizona is a very racist state. It's very sad, but finally we became blue, but still there's a lot of work to do out there. So one of the things that we were doing is we did a program that says Yo Soy Testigo, which is people were organizing around the collaboration with Border Patrol and the police and the sheriff and the troopers. And so we started organizing around that. And we had a lot of problems. Every time we were on the streets, protesting, we were treated like criminals by the police. We were treated like terrorists. Remember, this is after 9/11. So the terrorists were coming through the desert. That's what they were saying. So we started looking at more and more militarization of the border. So every time there's a policy changing, people die. It's one of the main things that we are focusing on. That's why we are so poor and we don't have a lot of donations, but we do our best to be out there, to be always arguing with the police and the collaboration and Border Patrol. I don't know if you guys saw the news, but on the 20th of this last month, this Tohono man was killed by a Border Patrol. He called the Border Patrol because there was a lot of migrants walking through his property. He lives a mile away from the border. The Border Patrol agent came in and he came out of his house, not even 2 steps from his doorstep. He was killed, 38 shots. And this is what we see every day in Tucson. in the Border Patrol, there's not a department where you could go and build a case against the agent, the criminal agent. Like in police, they have a special department to go and build a case against them. Border Patrol, there's not accountability. They don't face a court. They don't go to jail. So this is one of the main things that we have to talk about. Why are we facing the same things over and over for 20 some years? We're doing the same thing. Our morgue in Tucson is always housing 300 plus bodies in those special semi trucks. You know, the freezer trucks is full of migrants. So this is the kind of thing that we should be talking on our news to change these policies who are killing people and people who are running away from governments. Their own American corporations are causing in their countries. Thank you so much, you guys. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have more hope because you guys are young. We need you. We need you out there in the streets, raising the voice for our communities, for our color communities. Thank you so much.
My name is Jordan Dean. I am from Ohio, Cincinnati. I go to the School of Creative and Performing Arts, where I will be a senior. And I'm here on behalf of Youth at the Center, Young Not Silent. And I like to say, I believe mutual trust is essential between first responders and the people they serve, because without it, there's an uncertainty of intent from the people in the communities on how cops show up for them. There's a distrust found within communities, and it's not this inner city culture of hating police. It's a past that has provided us insight of what police were meant for. When we talk about police, we need to acknowledge the origin of its purpose. When we do, we can better understand the disconnect marginalized communities might have with police officers or any first responders. The literal first unofficial police in America were slave patrol units responsible for capturing the runaway enslaved. And we shouldn't forget the people who were capturing the enslaved were lower middle to middle class white people, which in my opinion mirrors policing dynamics in Cincinnati and nationwide. As we continue to converse about the harsh treatment and killings police have been responsible for, we need to understand from the beginning of the American experiment, the relationship they have had to especially Black communities have always been brutal, and they have been charged with perpetuating the white supremacist system. Reconstruction made trust between police and Black communities even more difficult because it was hard to tell the difference between lynch mob members and police units. I think having alternative first responders would be a step in the right direction if we're talking about them being unarmed. A problem I see with policing, a big factor of it is just power. Changing the power dynamics put in place, if successful, we can examine the faults in how the police system is set up. Yes, we can, better have alternative for situations that might not need guns or the level of brutality we often find police using in the community. Thank you.
I'm the VP of Community Engagement and Education at the Institute for American Policing Reform with Nick. But I am new to the field of policing. So I have learned a ton from all of you in the last day. And my background is in peace building and conflict transformation internationally. So I've moved back to the US 3 years ago from Israel, Palestine, where I was working with groups there, civil society leaders and government officials in programming around conflict transformation in different angles. And my research background is the Northern Ireland conflict and the causal changes on their 20-year path to peace, particularly for militant organizations. So when talking about trust and thinking about trust, I just want to share my frame of reference. I'm thinking about trust between people who've tried to kill each other, between groups who have deep sense of victimization from the other group. So some of that is relevant and some of it might not be. But what I would like to do is share some of the lessons that I've learned from that field with you here. So in my view, trust is most effectively built through two simultaneous processes. One is humanizing the other and members from the other group through personal relationships, personal conversations, through facilitated space where people have the opportunity to express vulnerability and to show up for each other when they express vulnerability. So this is not small talk. This is not political debate. This is not coffee with a cup. While things like coffee with a cup have great intention and may be useful, the purpose is not for building trust with people, with others who normally wouldn't be trusting of police. And as a background, so peace research, mainly starting in 2007 with evaluations of peace building programs from around the world, disproved contact theory. And a lot of interventionists will come in and try to say, let's just bring people together to build trust. Let's just get to know each other. And what we find is simple exposure to the other is not only ineffective at building deep, lasting trust, but it can also be harmful. Because people will come away from these meetings sometimes with having their prejudices reaffirmed, and sometimes having the power asymmetries of the situation reaffirmed as well. So what we need is a process of repeated engagement, so not one-off gatherings, and as I mentioned, this personal, deeper connection where people can share their own stories and build empathy. So that's one of those processes. The second process is joint work for shared purpose. And this builds confidence in the other's intentions, with people working together in good faith on addressing some of the problems that usually divide them. But one without the other, so humanizing without also having action, or having joint action without having these personal connections, leaves a very high risk for trust to break down. It might build trust temporarily, but it's very hard to keep it sustained. And what we need is really proof of action, that members can practice what members of these, or participants in these processes can practice what they preach. It's very easy to have a personal connection with someone, and then after going back to your own communities, seeing that person that you met just continuing with some of the behaviors that are oppressive to your community can break that down very easily. I think that's sort of common sense, but it took many years of peace work to understand this. So I'd like to give one example of something that has both of these processes, and that's from Northern Ireland, where in the early 90s, we had members of the IRA and members, which is the Irish Republican Army, for those of you who might not be familiar, and members of rival militant organizations. Okay, so people who had been in prison for 15, 17, 18 years were released in the early 90s. Their sentences were up. And these are enemies who have tried to kill each other, who have authorized killings from prison. They come out and they were brought together by local faith leaders to engage in dialogue. And what was so interesting is that they not only talked to each other and got to understand each other and shared some common experiences, they were brought together around a shared purpose, which was re-entry into society, because they had a whole slew of problems that those of you who are familiar with formerly incarcerated life could understand, right? They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't get benefits from an unemployment and otherwise. They couldn't get car insurance. They were denied housing. So it was very difficult. And they came together to try to address these problems, even though they were supposed to be enemies. These relationships became the seeds of the peace process in Northern Ireland. These people became the agents of change in their own militant organizations, in their wider communities. And this is within 10 years of peace being signed and then a larger process of implementation of the peace deal. So I'm not going to go too much into detail. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But it's just an example of how these heroes with credibility in their own community through joint work and humanizing the other were really able to build trust that's sustained. One more thing. Okay with time? Okay. I would like to say something about interconnectivity. So the problems we're trying to address here at the Institute for American Policing Reform and the problems in conflict transformation work, they're systemic problems and they require systemic, holistic approaches. So in conflict work, we talk about in order for an intervention to be effective systemically, we look at 3 levels of society, sort of a pyramid: the political echelon, larger societal leadership, and grassroots leadership. And what's important is that influence flow in all the directions, right? So it means people, grassroots efforts are able to influence up, and middle level leadership is able to influence both up and down. 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Okay. So let me see. So it's important that work is interconnected between these various levels of society, right? Not working in silos separate from each other. And I mentioned internal agents of change. It's also important that we have external actors to apply pressure and to offer incentives. So changing deeply entrenched relationships, cultural norms, institutions, systems, interconnectivity is key. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks, Tab.
See how bad it would have been if I didn't let Ariel give her statement. So I have a couple of questions, and if you all have questions or comments, I wasn't here yesterday. How have you been doing that? Going up? Yeah, so you can go up whenever you would like. So my first question is about dispatch when we're implementing these alternative response. And in some of the cities that I visited, there's been some reluctance from dispatch to send out alternative responders alone, right? That it ends up becoming a co-response. So I thought that I would ask Ariel and Nick if you could just talk about that, or maybe give even a couple of suggestions about, how do you move forward in a concrete way? And we are happy for other people in the audience. If you have thoughts on this, you can also answer the questions. Just raise your hand, I'll bring you a mic. But we'll start with Ariel and Nick.
Just going to start on a general level. I mean, I started my career in policing by being a dispatcher, or dispatching police and fire, actually. And what's so key about this critical role is in terms of what they hear and the receipt of this call for service ultimately at least sets the stage for how the responders and what that responder brings to the field. And so what we find and have been finding as we begin to look back on where the real critical pieces are in engagement and how the police engage, that dispatcher is such an essential part of this response, because how they hear, what questions they ask, how they discover what is really being requested will set the stage. Because if the caller presents information that's mixed with, first of all, their interpretation of what's going on, and then it's mixed with, limited understanding because the dispatcher is only going on what he or she is being told, and then that's passed on to the police officers, the police officers will tend to bring, again, because this, being trained and sort of inculcated around systems of security and self-preservation and safety, it determines at what level we begin the encounter and how quickly you can escalate from here to here, or how quickly you de-escalate situations. And so it's a critical role. And as it says, the saying goes, I'm not sure it's a very good one, but information is power. But information, the wrong information, could lead to an abuse of power, or the misuse of power, or an unintended use of power, or malpractice of power.
Okay. I wanted to add that building trust between dispatch and first responders and police and communities. So what's the purpose of building trust? We're not building trust for the sake of building trust. We're building trust to have relationships that are resilient to destructive forces, right? We're building trust so that in a crisis, groups can turn to each other and keep communicating and not break down into their silos and become destructive. We're building trust so that the efforts that these different groups are doing towards positive change, including first responders and dispatchers who are adapting to the new situation of policing, of your efforts. Trust so that their effects won't be, their work, their progress won't be negated in crises. So I would say that all of these groups need to understand that it serves their interest to build trust, right? Resilient relationships enable resilient communities. And I guess it just goes back to the interconnectivity that we can't build those by working in silos. So we really do need all these groups to go through trust building processes.